Hello everyone, and welcome to Biology 112, the evolutionary impact of humans on the environment. My name is Lynn Carpenter, and I'm going to be your instructor this term. I apologize, lecture's a little bit late this week. I've been having some fun with technical difficulties, as you know, I should have known. Just to tell you a little bit about the class, it's a mini course, and so it only lasts for half a semester, which makes me sad because we're talking about one of my favorite topics. The reason I created this course, just to give you guys a little background information, is that I started to find it really interesting that humans have basically impacted every other species we've ever come into contact with. And so we very often consider the topic of evolution, but not how critters have evolved because of us. Okay, so the purpose of this class is, majors or non-majors are fine. If you don't have any background in biology, not a big deal. But the purpose is to be fun and to have you guys learn and kind of give you a different perspective on humans and our role in the environment. So to give you an idea of what's expected, as I said, we meet the first half of the semester. We will have 4 quizzes. They're only worth 25 points apiece. If you guys listen to lectures and you take notes and you're learning, you'll be fine. It's open note, open book, okay? And then we're all going to work on a project together. You may or may not have heard that I've written a book for this class, and I'm pretty excited about it. It's at the University of Michigan Press right now. But what I would love to do is have us all work on a webpage together whereby we add information on this webpage that not necessarily found in the book. And so then it gives people an idea of, why this is all really cool, and why humans should be interested in how we impact all these other species. And so that part, what's going to happen is I will upload a copy of the book to you guys. Please keep in mind it's not typeset because it's at the publishers right now. As I said, Michigan is publishing it. But I will send you guys a PDF file, and I'd love some comments as you guys are reading through it too about things that you do or don't find interesting, because there's always time to edit and so forth. And then once we go ahead and I'll send that out probably today, okay? But what I'd like you guys to do until then is check through the syllabus, find a topic that you'd like to learn more about, because your contributions to the webpage were basically expanding on things that we may or may not get to in the course, but that you're really interested in, okay? And so, again, the purpose of this is to be fun and relaxed and laid back because, things are too stressful and stress is no fun. So I want us just to have a good time this semester, and I hope you guys learn some cool information. So just to give you guys an idea of what we're actually covering this term, we will start out with a brief evolutionary history of humans. Please keep in mind there's an entire amazing anthropology part of this campus and department, and they have their own details and so forth, and we're not even going to get close to all the details that they would cover. But we're looking at this from a perspective of how humans have evolved and how that changed our interactions with critters. So briefly, human evolution, when we moved between continents, unfortunately we caused a lot of extinctions. There's a lot of interesting stuff there to cover. Then we'll talk about how humans switched from hunting and gathering to agriculture. Okay, so we started a farm. Land development and fragmentation, pollution, how when humans traveled, they brought a bunch of invasive species with them on purpose for some of them, oh yay, and on accident for others. We'll talk about urban reclamation. That's a pretty interesting one too. If humans all of a sudden disappeared and moved out of areas, nature would win, believe it or not. We'll focus on GMOs, antibiotics, how critters are evolving to current climate change. We'll talk about the idea of de-extinction potentials. Now, I'm not talking Jurassic Park because I used to work in the field of ancient DNA, and those movies, as great as it was that they got people interested in science, the science was just so incredibly wrong, it used to give me headaches. So we'll cover why Jurassic Park probably is never going to happen, but we'll deal with that later. And then we'll talk about human evolution. We like to think we're exempt, but realistically we're not. We're changing just like all the other critters are, and that's actually pretty cool. So let's go ahead and start out with the brief snippet on human evolution. So our impact on the environment has changed drastically over time. So initially we were hunters and gatherers, okay? And when we were trying to go chase after food. We had to move around a lot. We had to invent spears and fishing and so forth so we could all, get food. Now, our environment, our impact on the environment back then was kind of minimal relative to the way it is now. What I'd like you to think about are the different ways that when we were hunters and gatherers that we did impact the environment. So give it a second. think about different ways we impacted the environment, and then when you're ready, go ahead and start up lecture again. So eventually, we evolved and we started to focus on agriculture more than hunting and gathering. Now, what I want you to to realize is that it's not like we flipped a switch, okay, where we said, okay, everybody stop hunting and gathering, and now we need to go to agriculture. It depended on where the civilizations were and if they wanted to switch to agriculture and what they were exposed to and all sorts of other type of stuff. However, what I also want you to consider now, pause the video, is I want you to think about the different ways that once we switched to agriculture, species were impacted. Okay, and so I'm just having you briefly think about this now, but I promise we will get into more depth with this, and I will tell you what I'm expecting once we hit those particular slides. Okay, so eventually humans evolved and became even more advanced, although sometimes I seriously wonder about that, and we went through the Industrial Revolution, okay? And so think back to history class that you all may or may not have wanted to remember, and humans sort of moved into the Industrial Revolution. So this meant, power plants and constant power sources, and it meant factories, and we really had a huge impact on the environment then because we really started to transform the landscape even more than just when we were through agriculture. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is pause lecture again and think about, okay, so once humans moved into the Industrial Revolution, how did we impact the environment all around us? Now, I don't know how many of you are science majors or not science majors, but you may or may not panic whenever you see a graph. And so what I want you to do is not panic, okay? So the first thing that you do when you see a graph like this or an illustration is you read the axis. And so down the y-axis, you'll see that we go from modern day, which is 0 at the top, upper left, to 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 8 million years ago. Okay, so y-axis here is meant to represent time. And then the different species of humans that existed over time is over the x-axis. Okay, and so these are meant to illustrate when the modern Homo sapiens came about, and then the pre-modern, and then going all the way back to the earliest of humans. Okay, so the other thing I want you to notice from this, you don't have to memorize this, goodness, that would be awful. But this is an interesting concept that, look at the very top where Homo sapiens are. Okay, first off, we're the only surviving species of humans. I honestly have this hypothesis. Now keep in mind there's no way to substantiate this. But I genuinely have this hypothesis that maybe the reason we're the only ones left is because we couldn't play well with others. And the way things are going these days, yeah, I can kind of see that. Just kidding, everyone. Okay, but it's not always been that way. So Homo sapiens used to exist at the same time with the Neanderthals and the Homo florensis, and I remember when those were first discovered, and everybody got super excited because Lord of the Rings had just came out, and so they thought that they'd actually found true hobbit species. That was a long time ago. But, so at one point in time, there were multiple species of humans roaming the earth, okay? And that, to me, actually is pretty interesting. So as humans evolved over millions of years, our stature changed, the size of our brain changed, our habits changed, okay? And so there were definitely a lot of different changes that took place through the evolution of humans. Now, it's not easy to determine all of these changes, especially since, most of history is not written down. Only recently, when we develop language and writing and so forth, do we start writing things down. However, the fossil record shows what it shows, and there's even some history captured in DNA, which I think is pretty interesting because, of course, ancient DNA was my area for a long, long time. For example, we know that Neanderthals did exist at the same time as Homo sapiens. However, they kept a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. We do know that there were successful crosses between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens because we seem to have retained some of their genes. Then that was discovered relatively recently. But it's interesting to me that they did eventually become extinct, whereas somehow we managed to stick around. Now, Homo sapiens did start out focusing on hunting and gathering, but we know that things didn't stay that way forever. But now let's dive into what hunting and gathering lifestyles actually meant, okay, for humans as well as for other species. So remember a little while back, a few minutes ago, I asked you to think of different ways that we impacted the environment. Okay, now we're going to revisit this in detail. So we know that when you're a hunting and gathering society, you tend to either be fully or semi-nomadic, which means you move around, okay? You also tend to live in small communities, and this should make sense. Unlike the way things are today. You would also have to have low population densities because you are specifically focused on, taking care of your kids. And so, because they are, families had to stay small and so forth, because realistically, whoever was with you, you had to take along. Okay, so it wasn't a lot of stuff. Boy, would that have been nice. Not a lot of big families. Additionally, there were no specialized political officials. Wow, can you imagine how awesome that must have been? Anyway, no politicians, yay! There was very little wealth differentiation among the different groups, and really they were only economically specialized by age and gender. And usually they did divide the labor by gender, and women would gather the wild plants, and men would fish and hunt, because, back in the day they were the stronger of the two sexes. So again, with this particular type of lifestyle, we know that they migrated often. They had to follow the food, and that should make sense, especially if they were going after animals and so forth, because think of winter now and how hard it would be to find food if it's buried in snow, although we really haven't had so much snow this year, but that's okay. They also were nomadic, so they had to take the family with them. Okay, because of that, they had a low number of children because they had to take whoever along was with them. Okay, so they relied on simple tools back in the day for hunting and fishing, and really they tended to focus on survival, so they didn't have art or music or writing or anything along those lines. Now, eventually technology would develop, even for humans back in the day, and they'd start using more and more tools. They would develop their hunting skills more and more, and they would become much more efficient because they would invent what are called clovis spears. So when this happened, up to this point, we were kind of scavengers, kind of fishermen, kind of trying to eke out a living, but we weren't that efficient of hunters. Well, once the clovis spears came about, we could really take down the larger, mammals. And because of that, we started to have a much larger impact on the environment. There's a hypothesis that suggests that we started to cause many different species extinctions back at the time, and we'll cover that in the next few slides in the next little while. But what I also want you to realize, though, is once this happened, humans started to move across the lands much more. And once they did, they also had a bigger impact on the environment. Make sure you all write that down. Okay, so once they became more advanced as hunters, they'd start moving across lands in different environments and have an even bigger impact on the environment than they did before. Now, the reason that we know humans moved around is based on mitochondrial DNA. And so what they found using mitochondrial DNA, and we'll cover that in the next slide, is that, all humans started out in Africa. We all started there. Okay, period, end of discussion. It has the largest genetic diversity there. People who have a more direct link, more recent link to Africa tend to have more genetic diversity. From a historical perspective, it's actually quite fascinating. But if you look at this graph, you can also see the dates of when humans started to move around. So 170 to 130,000 years, they were in Africa. Then they started to go out and move to Europe. Okay, they eventually made their way to Australia and so forth. And then eventually they got to the North America and then eventually South America. So we did start to scatter and we did start to move around once we had the capabilities. So you might be asking yourself, how do we know this? And I would say, aha, that is an excellent question. And the reason we know this is based on modern day genetic patterns of mitochondrial DNA. Okay, so what scientists did is they went through and took a sample of DNA from humans located all across the globe, and they sequenced the mitochondria. And what they looked for were mutations. Okay, and so mutations are distinguished and they're called different haplotypes. For example, you start out with haplotype 1. This is a genetic pattern for a certain region. Looking at that same region, if you check and see, you will see that there's a T that is mutated. It's gone from a C to a T. That's a second haplotype. Okay, then you look for haplotype 3, and I'm sorry, the spacing is off. I don't know what something happened in the translation. But then you see that there's another mutation. That's haplotype 3, and then you see there's another mutation later on down the road, and that's haplotype 4. And so you map out all of those mutations, okay, and you will see that haplotype 1 is probably the first haplotype, and then the others mutated off of them, and if you put them on a map, that is what gives you the very cool pattern that I just showed you a second ago. So using this information and the different patterns of haplotypes and where they're found, you can see when approximately and where humans went. Okay, so starting out in Africa, then moving up and over and eventually settling in Australia, and then eventually Europe up there, and then eventually crossed the land bridge, which was exposed during the last glacial maximum, probably approximately 18,000 years ago, front to North America, and then moving on down. Okay, now what's interesting about this is if you start paying attention to different mammals and when they went extinct according to the fossil record as humans moved around. So you might ask, well, what do I mean by that? And I will say, perfect question. Let's go to the next slide. So what scientists have noticed is that as humans started to move around, initially there were fossils of certain large megafauna, as they called them, but then once humans settled an area, those fossils disappeared, meaning they probably went extinct. For example, we had the woolly mammoths in North America, we had giant sloths, we had our own large cats, we had our flightless birds, so many cool species that unfortunately once humans got there, they kind of went extinct, and I honestly think it's because we ate them all. At least according to the fossil record. That's one hypothesis, and we'll discuss a few more in the next little while. Now, I created this figure, and I added some species in that eventually went extinct as humans got to these different areas, okay? And so if you pay attention, we've definitely lost species in Africa, and then eventually in Europe, and then North America, and then South America, okay? So one species that we're going to zero in on are the horses, okay? So if you'll notice in North America, they did actually go extinct at one time. Now this story is pretty interesting and kind of fascinating from a historical perspective, okay? What I want you to realize is North America used to have its own unique lineage of horses, okay? However, I also want you to know that they are all extinct right now, even though we still have horses in the US. So we'll talk about why in a second. So if you ever take an evolutionary bio course, you will discover that horses actually have evolved drastically and changed over time. They started out with the little Hyracotherum, which is the horse that's in the bottom left, and then they eventually evolved into Mesohippus and Piohippus, and then eventually Equus, and this is the lineage of horses we know and love today. Well, North America had its own native species of Equus, okay? And Europe did as well. And what's interesting is, according to the fossil record, they looked a little bit different, okay? However, once humans got to North America, as I said, sadly, all of the native horses went extinct because we ate them all. So you might be asking yourself, well, if all the native horses to North America went extinct, well, where did the horses that we know and love today in the United States come from? And I would say, aha, that is an excellent question. Got a guess? All right, everyone. So if you happen to guess the Spanish conquistadors or the Spanish explorers, I would say that is an excellent guess, and you would be correct. So all of the horses that we have today in North America actually came from the European explorers, okay? And what eventually happened is they brought horses over on ships with them, but then some got away or some were released and so forth. And they kind of had this perfect niche to go explore, and their populations expanded. And that's how we still manage to have some wild horses in North America today. Pretty cool, isn't it? Now, most of the continents in the world do not have large megafauna anymore, okay? And so one hypothesis that has been suggested to actually explain this is called the overkill hypothesis, okay? And so if you look at this graph, the first thing we do is take a deep breath and not panic. Second thing we do is, once again, we look at the axes, okay? So the y-axis, we're looking at percent survival of large mammal species, and then we're looking at the x-axis over time, okay? And then this is divided up on the right of the different continents, so Africa, Australia, North America, and so forth. Now, the little black arrows indicate when humans got to those areas. And then the green indicates the large mammal population of each of those continents. So, when humans evolved in Africa, we did start to become more efficient at hunting before we started moving around, and we did cause some species to go extinct. Once we hit Australia, oh, you betcha. The same for North America, and the same for Madagascar. So here's an interesting question for you. Africa still manages to have some big animals roaming around, and so you might be asking yourself, well, how come that's the case? And so there's been another hypothesis proposed to explain that, suggesting that in Africa the large mammals evolved with humans, and because of that they learned to be afraid of us, whereas in Australia, North America, and so forth, they didn't, which is why we ended up hunting them all to extinction. Now remember, this is just a hypothesis, okay? And it's not perfect, and fossil records have a lot of problems in them, and we're going to discuss why in the next few slides. But there's a reason this is just a hypothesis and no conclusion has been reached. Okay, so let's talk about some issues in the fossil record which directly tie to this on why we're still trying to figure out exactly what happened. So you might be asking, okay, so why isn't the fossil record perfect? And I would say, aha, that is an excellent question. But before we can address that, we need to discuss how fossils are made. Okay, so we're going to go through an example of how a fish fossil could be formed. And so let's say that a fish dies. And as it dies, it sinks to the bottom. This can happen, it just depends on the conditions. So if it does, and it sinks to the bottom, eventually it gets covered up with sediment. Okay, and so the sediment eventually will have heat and pressure, and eventually it will turn into rock. Okay, now the conditions have to actually be perfect for this to happen because it can't be decomposed, it can't get broken down, it can't get scavenged by any other critter. And you can imagine this is actually pretty rare because nature works today the way it used to work a long time ago, and most of the time critters will get scavenged. But if everything happens perfectly, it sinks to the bottom where there's no oxygen, it gets preserved, add some sediments over top, add some heat and pressure, it will actually convert to rock. Okay, but then humans have to find it. So let's say they go looking around and exploring, and they find this area where they're finding a whole bunch of fossils. That's actually really cool. And then once they do, they can figure out what critters lived where and when. Now, that's pretty awesome, but keep in mind how rare that has to be in order for everything to go just right. Now, fossils can happen many different ways, and so they fit into many different categories. So one example is unaltered remains, and a great example of this would be the woolly mammoths that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years and are just now, as the world is warming up, they're just now becoming discovered, okay? So that's the true actual fossil. You're not altering any part of it. And another great example of that would be amber. Okay, and so amber is really good. Oh, let's talk about Jurassic Park because this kills me. So amber is really good at preserving morphological details. In other words, what the creature looks like. Okay, but it's actually terrible at preserving DNA. It's very porous and oxygen flows through it a lot. And because of that, the DNA tends to get destroyed because oxygen is one of the biggest enemies to DNA. All right, so Jurassic Park will not happen, at least not based on the premise they used, because I've had friends that actually tried to replicate pulling out dinosaur DNA from amber, and all they ever recovered were contaminants. Okay, and so the people who published the paper are saying that they had actually discovered dinosaur DNA from fossils, and they got super excited and all of that. Well, they had to post a retraction, which was, you know, kind of the kiss of death when you're a scientist, because then people just kind of look at you. Okay, so amber does preserve the remains. Okay, then we get into mold and cast fossils. Now, in that situation, let's say we had our fish, and let's say the fish was buried. Okay, and then once the fish was buried, it, you know, adds some heat and pressure, and eventually the remains are turned to rock. Okay, now what can happen very often is that you'll have groundwater that actually seeps up into that rock. So I don't know if you guys have ever messed with fossils before. This just shows them in the right field because I've been messing with them my whole life. You can take certain types of fossils, and you can, if you have acidic water, it will actually dissolve the fossil. And I learned that the hard way and not the good way. But what remains if the fossil is dissolved is the shape, okay? And that's called the mold. So think of a jello mold, okay? So that the shape is retained even though the fossil is dissolved due to the acidic water. Well, the water sinks again and different water comes up and then fills that, which is carrying a bunch of sediment with it. And if that happens, that will fill that mold and create a cast. So it's kind of like it's a fossil. Definitely is a fossil, okay? But it's not the original one because the original one that converted to rock was eaten away long ago. But it definitely retains the shape because it was filling in the mold. Hopefully that makes sense. And I can always, if you guys have questions, let me know. You can also have what are called trace fossils, and trace fossils would be like footprints or holes in the ground that somebody dug, or, you know, something along those lines. Okay, and so last but not least, I realized I just made a mistake when I spoke earlier. The true form fossils, Okay, those would be like the amber because they retain the form, but it's not, it's not the actual DNA of the critter anymore because the internal things have been altered. Okay, so chemically they've been changed. So unaltered remains, we're talking the woolly mammoths that have been frozen. Mold and cast, think of our fish. Then the fish gets dissolved by groundwater, and then the mold, the jello mold, think of it as jello mold, will remain. Then other water will come up. It'll have all sorts of things dissolved in it that will then solidify, and they will form the cast, which gives you the shape of the fossil that was once there. So that's mold and cast. Then we have the trace fossils like footprints or tunnels or anything along those lines. And then we have the true form fossils like the amber, okay, which retains the shape of it. However, chemically, they definitely have been altered. Now, I hope that makes sense. And if not, please let me know. Now, in addition to the fact that you have to have just the perfect conditions for fossils to be found, okay, what I want you to keep in mind is there's even more issues with the fossil record. First of all, most fossils have not been found and they're still underground and they'll probably stay that way. Okay, so realistically speaking, we don't exactly know where to look for fossils. We can have a good idea, but a lot of stuff is either too far underground for us to get to or, we just don't know it's there. Secondly, remember that the animal and plant groups are not equally represented. So many dead animals will get scavenged or they'll decompose, and so they won't be represented in the fossil record. Additionally, many fossils will get destroyed. Okay, so we know that the earth plates move around through tectonic activity, and because of that, we know that as things are shifting around, the fossils could potentially get destroyed. So, and this is just some of the issues with the fossil record. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go to the next slides. Okay, so if you will recall, we said that the overkill hypothesis is a hypothesis, and there are alternatives to that, as with any hypothesis, okay? Realistically speaking, if you were to figure out why all the megafauna and the large mammals went extinct, you would have to have certain evidence to solve that controversy, okay? First off, you would need a bunch of fossils of the megafauna that show arrows in them, or evidence that they were eaten, or something along those lines. Well, think about all the controversial issues with the fossil record. You're never going to find that perfect of a fossil record for one species. Okay, so that is a hypothesis for why critters went extinct. So let's talk about the alternative hypothesis, and we'll talk about the more famous one. So one of the alternative hypotheses includes climate change. Okay, so whether we realize it or not, climate has changed continuously all throughout Earth's history. And this happens naturally through what are called Milankovitch cycles. Okay, so you might be wondering, well, what in the world are Milankovitch cycles? And I would say, aha, excellent question. So for example, there are 3 different parts to the Milankovitch cycles, and they all happen at different frequencies. The first is known as eccentricity, and this is the orbit which Earth follows around the sun. Sometimes it's more of a perfect circle or an oval, and sometimes it's very lopsided, as you can see from the diagram on the left, okay? So, and it just depends on where the Earth is throughout time, and that changes, okay? The next thing I want you to consider, and again, that's eccentricity in Earth's orbit. The tilt in Earth will actually change over time too. So the Earth tilts at different degrees, okay? And so that can make a difference with regards to the climate change. And then the last part is known as precession. And so I don't know if you guys have ever seen a gyroscope. Think of a top, okay? So you're spinning a top, and then it starts to lean and kind of move around. Well, Earth does that too, and yet amazing, we're all still on the surface. Yay, gravity! Anyway, so precession just means which way the top is spinning, okay, or how much it's lopsided and so forth. And so if that makes sense, then you will definitely be fine for anything that I'm going to ask you. So remember, it's eccentricity, which is just variation in the shape of the orbit. It varies in the tilt, okay, and then it varies in the precession, which think of a top and how the top kind of spins. Okay, and so those are the 3 different parts of the Milankovitch cycles, and they all cause climate change naturally. So you might be asking yourself, well, how much has this caused climate to change? And I would say, excellent question. So we have a graph, and in our graph on the y-axis, we're looking at warmer temperatures and colder temperatures. On the x, we're looking at time. Okay, and so modern day is the zero, and then we're talking thousands of years ago. And what you'll notice is that there have been many different times where it's been much colder than it is now. That's known as glacial periods, where everything was covered by glaciers, and it's also been much warmer than it is now. Okay, those are known as interglacial periods. You'll also notice that, temperature is changing. We've been through, it looks like we're heading towards an interglacial period. Things are supposed to be warming. Again, this isn't perfect, but it does give you an idea of the range. So if you have such a range, it might have a pretty big impact on the critters. And rather than the overkill hypothesis, maybe climate change is what actually caused the creatures to go extinct. So again, alternative hypothesis, you always want to consider the different sides. So if in fact it was climate change, okay, then several different things are going to happen. There's going to be a lack of food because, woolly mammoths eat a lot, probably why I identify with those guys, because they graze all day, and so could I. This could also cause stress, okay? And there's a YouTube video, and I will send that link out to you guys, where they're actually preferring the climate change hypothesis for the extinction of the megafauna. And I think it's still too early to call personally. I think both hypotheses could potentially still be valid. There's really been no perfect answer for this, but I will show you the video just because it's important to know where science stands, with different hypotheses and what's really out there. So, extinction isn't just a thing of the past, as I'm sure many of you know. So we have many modern extinction events. Passenger pigeons went extinct not too long ago. That's actually a relatively sad story. There was one passenger pigeon. Well, initially, passenger pigeons used to be so plentiful that they darkened the skies, according to the earliest explorer. There were millions upon millions upon millions of birds. But eventually you may not realize this, but the invention of the refrigerated train car is what caused them to go extinct, because people would then hunt them to the point of reckless abandon, and they would ship them and sell them and make a ton of money. But as they did this, they weren't paying attention to population sizes, and the passenger pigeon populations became dangerously low, and down to the point where there was only one passenger pigeon left, and her name was Martha, and she was in a zoo. Can you imagine how sad it would be to be the last of your species? Oh my goodness. But, eventually Martha died in the early 1900s, I believe, and so then passenger pigeons became extinct. We also used to have our own parrots called the Carolina parakeet in Illinois, but once, not just in Illinois, in North America, but once ladies' fashion came in vogue and they wanted feathers for hats, that's when the parrots started to suffer. Eventually, also, we have West African black rhinos that are virtually extinct, and I think there was only 2 left, which is incredibly sad. And we have the quaggas, which look like a cross between a zebra and a horse, and those guys went extinct too. So it's not as if, we don't still have extinctions, and we kind of know this, and as scientists, it's why we're panicking a little bit, because we don't want any more extinctions to happen. Now, nature is resilient, and as Jeff Goldblum said in the first Jurassic Park, nature finds a way. And so I find this part actually fascinating, is that nature is evolving in response to humans. One example, elephants can be born with or without tusks, okay? And you can imagine those that get hunted are those that have the largest tusks, because those are what the humans are after. Well, a while back, I think only 15% of elephants were born without tusks. They're known as tuskless, okay? But only 15% of elephants would be born that way. Well, now the percentage is actually much higher, and I think it's in the 20s, okay? 22% are now being born without tusks. And you might ask, well, why is that a good thing? Well, they don't have any tusks. Why would they be hunted? Okay, so they are evolving in response to humans. I just hope they can keep going and, beat us. And so they survive. Big fan of the pachyderms, gotta tell you. I like the elephants. They get grumpy and so forth, but they're actually pretty cool critters. Bighorn sheep, also hunted for their horns. They're being born now with smaller horns. Okay, fish, many of the fish, if you think about those that there's the problem of overfishing, and so there's a size limit. Well, what's really interesting about this is it used to be that fish had to get really big before they could reproduce, but now they can actually reproduce at smaller sizes, which is kind of what saves them, because if they get caught in the nets, they have to get let go. Okay, so if they can reproduce at that time, then hey, they do really well. Isn't nature great? I mean, how cool is that? All right, so now we even have birds that are learning to avoid cars. Also incredibly awesome. Okay, so they used to get hammered by cars a while back when they would build nests underneath bridges because it's a really convenient place for them to build nests, and they would just get slammed left and right by cars, of course. Well, over time, they're learning to actually avoid the cars, okay, and scientists have discovered that this trait is getting passed on to the next generations, or it's being taught to the next generations. So, critters can evolve in response to humans, and honestly, they've got my vote. Okay, so I hope they can definitely survive all the crazy things we do. Now, if you're ever asked to define evolution in this class, hint, maybe on a quiz, if you're ever asked to define evolution in a class, I want you to define it as changing gene frequencies through time. Okay, so what this means is you have a population and it's made of a genetic makeup of some particular inhabitants, and over time, that genetic pattern will change. Those frequencies and the number of genes in that population will change. The other thing you need to keep in mind is that individuals can't evolve, but populations do. Okay, so populations can evolve over time. Now, the person credited with this, of course, is Charles Darwin. And, you know, there were actually two scientists that came up with the idea of evolution. Charles came up with it first. He went on a journey to sail around the world. Poor Charles caught a lot of flack back in the day, but realistically speaking, he was a very kind, mild-mannered man by anybody who knew him. Okay, so initially, Charles's dad wanted him to be a doctor. He did come from a wealthy family, and his father expected that he was very smart and he should become a doctor. Well, Charles went into his first surgery, and I'd like you all to imagine this. You're going to observe your first surgery, and they don't have anesthesia invented by then. So you're going into your first surgery, there's a lot of blood, a lot of screaming, and a lot of awfulness. Well, Charles took one look at that, realized it wasn't for him, and he turned around and left. Okay. So then his father said, why don't you become a minister and a parson and have your own country church? And Charles was like, sure, okay, that sounds good. So he went to school to initially take classes to go towards that route, but over time he had the opportunity to go sailing around the world. Now, this is interesting because initially his father wouldn't let him, but he went to his uncle, and an uncle pressured him, and eventually they decided to let him go. And as he sailed around the world, now we're not talking, you know, cushy cruise ship. We're talking he slept in a hammock on a wooden ship and probably got seasick like crazy. And I could not do this, I gotta tell you. But as he went around the world, he noticed some interesting things and came up with this idea of evolution, or changing frequencies through time. But what I want you to remember is he didn't know what a gene was back then. Okay, now the other person that discovered this at the same time, a similar time as Darwin, was Alfred Russel Wallace. And Darwin is credited with discovering evolution, but realistically speaking, the idea had been around for quite a while, and Wallace kind of came up with it at the same time. But they co-presented it together at the Linnean Society way back in the day, although Charles tends to be the person who gets the credit for coming up with this idea for whatever reason. But I always try to chip in that it was actually two people that published simultaneously and should have credit for it. So Darwin and Wallace, yay! So again, Darwin didn't know what a gene was, and he didn't know how traits were inherited, but he came up with the idea of natural selection, where organisms with certain inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than others. Okay. Other things you need to know as we start talking about evolution in the class is I want you to be able to define a population, which is a group of interbreeding individuals living in the same place and the same time. Okay. Last but not least, an evolutionary adaptation. So a population increases in the frequency of traits that are better suited to the environment. So you might be asking, okay, so these are all great, but how would you actually apply this information? I would say, haha, excellent question. Okay, so if we consider our elephants, for example, and we say that they're evolving in response to humans, they are being selected to have smaller or no tusks. Okay, so the tuskless elephants are being selected for. It's not necessarily the process of natural selection because it's being driven by humans, but it's a sort of selection, okay? When it's nature and humans are not messing it up, it's called natural selection. But realistically speaking, this is driven by humans. I don't know that there's a word for it yet. The population, remember that the population you're looking at is the population of elephants. So all these different individuals in the herd, okay? And then last but not least, the evolutionary adaptation would be the lack of tusks, or the smaller horns in the bighorn sheep, or the adaptation would be being able to reproduce at a smaller size for the fish. Okay, so that's the evolutionary adaptation. So hopefully this all makes sense. If you guys have any questions, I was going to monitor the chat and so forth too, so you're welcome to either send them through email or put them on the chat. I always like having you guys work together. This is the first of 2 lectures that I will upload today. So I'm going to get this one up now as soon as I can, but then the second one may not appear until later this evening, just because it took me forever to figure out how to get all the technical difficulties worked out, but it will be posted ASAP. So talk to you guys pretty soon.